So the questions we're here to ponder ostensibly as a starting point: how do we perceive race and ethnicity when a racially and ethnically diverse cast performs Shakespeare? And how do we perceive a Shakespeare play when non-white actors perform roles, characters intended to be performed by white actors? And I'm so grateful to have a couple actors on the panel. How do actors of color approach and experience, both in rehearsal and performance, the taking on of those roles? And I also want to pose as a possible question to consider: to what extent does multicultural Shakespeare become color conscious or color blind? That's a distinction that really is interesting to me, and I hope that we'll have some opportunity to talk about that. So we've assembled a really distinguished panel of guest thinkers and artists to help us ponder these issues. And what I want to do is start by introducing Laura Bovilsky, who is our historian, and we'll talk about, the title of her lecture actually is Shakespeare's Multiculturalism circa 1601. So before I introduce her, though, I just want to make a brief word about the format. So Laura will give her lecture, and after that, I'll just have the members of the panel come up. I'll ask each of them to ponder the main questions I've just sort of put forward for 5 minutes each. Then we'll segue into a more free-form discussion with them, and then at the end, of course, we'll save time for questions from the audience. So let me get my cheat sheet here and introduce Laura Bovilsky, Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the English Department at the University of Oregon. Her research focuses on early modern understandings of group and individual identities. Her first book, A Barbarous Play, Race on the English Renaissance Stage, was published in 2008. She is currently writing a new work, Almost Human, The Limits of Personhood in Early Modern England. She has won the U of O's Martin Luther King Jr. Award from the Division of Equity and Inclusion, as well as a Mellon Fellowship for work promoting cross-racial understanding. So please help me welcome Laura Bovilsky.
So I'm just going to repeat the question that David started us off with, the kind of the brief of this panel. How do we perceive race and ethnicity when a racially and ethnically diverse cast performs a Shakespeare play? And I've been asked to provide some of the deep background to this question, to go over a little bit of how Shakespeare, his fellow acting company members, and their audience might have thought about race and ethnicity and its theatrical representations. And if we could travel back in time, just like Shatner, no doubt. Our framing question could be restated a little. How did early modern English theater companies and their audiences perceive race and ethnicity when a racially and ethnically homogeneous cast performed a Shakespeare play? And there are lots of ways to begin to answer that question, and my first impulse is to actually turn it into additional questions that can help us answer it. Questions like, how did Shakespeare's theater companies perform racial and ethnic diversity? And I can answer that more when we have more general conversation. I'm not going to actually dwell on that piece of it in these remarks. But also, why did they perform racial and ethnic diversity? Something I'll start with. And how did they and their audiences think about racial and ethnic diversity? And I want to make sure that we spend most of our time on the larger presentist question, which is the center of our present day. So I'm going to just answer these questions in brief, and then we'll get to the larger conversation. So why did they perform racial and ethnic diversity? For many years during the 19th century and most of the 20th century as well, scholars assumed that Shakespeare's London afforded little contact with representatives of groups we would now judge produce a multicultural community. That is, groups whose inclusion in a community we now see as diversifying that community. And I'm going to come back to that now that I've repeated twice. And scholars were occasionally interested in Shakespeare's representation of non-English characters, but assumed that they testified primarily to the power of Shakespeare's imagination, which was often the answer to any question about Shakespeare in those days. And in fact, as vast amounts of intervening scholarship have taught us, London in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, that is Shakespeare's professional lifespan, was a very diverse and often cosmopolitan city. Some 4 to 5% of London's inhabitants, that translates to about 5,000 to 10,000 human beings, were from other countries. or their parents were from other countries. And in fact, earlier in the 16th century, when London was much smaller, the percentage was as high, we think, as 12 to 13%. So just a large international sense of that city. Many were elite coming to England to pursue trades and professions. So Dutch, Levantine, and Venetian traders, Jewish doctors, Jewish musicians, and diplomatic cadres from a variety of countries. But the vast majority were humbler folk, coming in search of better economic opportunity, in search of religious freedom or political opportunity. And the largest of these groups were Dutch and French Protestants, but they included Walloons and Flemish, Jewish conversos, Greek and Hungarian refugees, and individuals from as far away as modern-day Iran, India, and Bengal. Many more diverse groups entered as seamen, participating in England's fishing, cloth, and shipping industries, and others for the pleasure of personal travel, which was now available at scale. In some cases, immigrants from other lands, we should remember, came involuntarily, as slaves or captives, a lot of Africans and some natives from the Americas. And however, not all of these were or remained slaves and captives. Many came as servants and set up households of their own, as parish records indicate. We'll see, oh, no, it's not liking that. There we go. So this is a parish record that just shows funeral preparations for an African resident of the parish. There's hundreds of these kinds of records where a lot of the documentation of the African community in London derives. And moreover, because importantly, we are talking about a time, and this really has to be stressed, before the rise of plantation-based chattel slavery, a time when slaves were routinely able to buy their own freedom, and when slave status could not be passed on to offspring. There was also a sizable population of Africans and of former slaves and the children of slaves living as freed and free people in London. And in addition to Native Americans brought in an involuntary way, there were Native Americans who chose to visit out of curiosity and choice as well. And so one famous one is Pocahontas, here dressed up in high Jacobean regalia. And this is 1616, so the year of Shakespeare's death. Moreover, because importantly, I just said that, and in addition to these individuals and communities, London attracted slowly growing numbers of members of other ethnic and national groups from the British Isles themselves, Scots, Picts, Welsh, Irish. And these groups were typically seen by the English as belonging to different nations and were often strongly racialized by them at that time in ways that might seem startling to us now. And I want to pause on this list, this long list of different groups for a few reasons. First, to underscore that the question about why so many of Shakespeare's plays feature ethnically, racially, and nationally diverse characters is partly answered just by this demographic record. Diversity on stage both mirrored and presented reactions to experiences of domestic diversity. And second, it's worth noting straight away that English reactions to this diverse and international London scene can't be predicted by the fact of multiculturalism itself. They included both xenophobic and xenophilic elements. In real life and in plays, we find nativist and hostile reactions to various of these groups, often provoked by times and situations of economic competition and stress in ways that we can recognize now. And in real life and in plays, there were also responses showing the interest and excitement of city dwellers in a cosmopolitan community, feelings we can recognize to this day that find diversity itself attractive and broadening. Third, it's worth considering this international demography as a whole because it bears on that last question I just asked about how the English understood race and racial diversity at the most basic level. So thinking about how these groups were understood and represented helps us identify samenesses and differences between early modern English views and our own that in turn help us think more broadly about theatrical diversity and its meanings in Shakespeare then and now. The meanings and impact of these different groups and constituencies, then and now and here, possess both similarities and differences. The early modern English did not necessarily categorize larger ethnic, racial, and national groups in the same ways that we do. Here in the US in 2016, many of the groups that I've just mentioned might no longer seem as though they were different races from the English. We identify natives of the Netherlands, France, or Spain, let alone Ireland and Wales, as white and European. But in Shakespeare's day, concepts of communal, shared racial whiteness were still a very long way off. and the idea of collective, amiable European experience was hinted at only in intellectual networks, which themselves extended beyond European borders. The countries of Europe did not see themselves as part of a collective. Instead, they were continuously steeped in bitter tensions and often violent struggles over empire and political power, extreme religious strife, and economic competition. England occupied a precarious position in most of these contests. Both Henry VIII and Elizabeth I had been excommunicated by the Pope, and often marginalizing England from political and economic alliances with the European countries that thought of themselves as unified by their Catholic faith. And generally, England was resource and cash poor, and often unable to compete well in trade, far less powerful, for instance, than the Habsburg Empire that linked Spain, the Netherlands, and much of Eastern Europe, as well as a lot of land territory in the Americas. So these geopolitical, economic, and religious factors meant that the English did not identify as part of a continental collective, nor readily perceive themselves as sharing cultural or other forms of identity with these populations of Europe. And instead, they saw most of them as bitter political and religious enemies. In fact, precisely because so many of the European nations and empires were actively hostile to England economically, religiously, and politically, with the Catholic countries and alliances particularly hated, feared, and therefore racialized by the English. The English under Elizabeth regularly pursued economic and military supply alliances with the Muslim world, both with the North African states, especially Morocco, and the Ottoman Empire, with Elizabeth sending raw materials to be used in armaments in exchange for sugar, fine goods, saltpeter for manufacturing gunpowder, and gold. Here's Murad III, the emperor of the Ottoman Empire during this period. Had extensive relationships with Elizabeth. So envoys and diplomats from the Islamic world regularly visited London to facilitate these relationships. And Elizabeth and her Muslim counterparts, cultivated a sense of shared religious values, particularly dwelling on their mutual hatred of idolatry, icons, and priestly mediation with God. If England was in some ways allied with the Islamic world, however, there were other tensions between those state partners at the local level. And notably, members of English fishing and shipping communities were routinely kidnapped and enslaved by North American pirates in the thousands. So many that in 1601, the word slave in England would have connoted English captives rather than members of African or other groups, as I think modern American audiences would likely assume. And weekly collections were taken at church for the enfranchisement of captive English folk. And similarly, there were tensions between state policies that encouraged immigration for its economic benefits, and modernized the English cloth industry, which was the mainstay of the economy. But there were often tensions between those policies and the city level, where members of guilds were competing with these new immigrants and often wanted them shut out. So we can see tensions around immigration and economics that I think have a lot of resonance with issues we see today abundantly. So in talking geopolitics, as I've been doing, even as we develop a more precise sense of the full range of human beings that Shakespeare and his audience would have had a real chance of trading with, living nearby, catching a glimpse of, or thinking about as directly tied to English national interests, we're getting away from our framing perceptual questions about how these same people thought about race and ethnicity, and how those categories figured and were figured on Shakespeare's stage. So I've chosen today the year 1601 as an especially rich year. It's a little bit of a fix there, but to which to turn our attention. The Merchant of Venice, first performed between 1596 and 1598, was that year was first published in quarto in 1600. Here's a little picture of it. And Othello was possibly being written as early as 1601. And this is a later publication, but it was being written and performed sometime before 1604. So these two plays are, of course, the best known Shakespearean meditations on the identity of racial and ethnic minorities, partly because they treat major characters whose identities, Jewish and Moorish, remain key in thinking about multiculturalism today. And as we will see, they don't reflect on those characters in isolation. Race in Shakespeare is always represented in the context of this international and ethnic diversity, with relations and analogies between individuals and groups key in generating and pressuring theatrical treatments of race and other currents and issues that are presented in these plays. So working from Othello and Merchant as example texts, we'll think very briefly about some features of the representation of race in Shakespeare. So then as now, race does not, and I would suggest that it cannot, figure in a straightforwardly realistic manner. So I'll trace some of the ways in which race works in these narratives, from just a couple simple to one less obvious axiom. Because I can't do so exhaustively, I'm picking premises that I hope will easily translate to ways that we can adapt this conversation to the question of modern Shakespeare adaptations and transition into the meat of today's conversation. So first, theatrical race can draw on, refer to, or take a charge from specific topical matters, even if those are not directly figured in a play. So in the case of Othello, we can note that the showy and months-long presence in London in 1600 of the Moroccan ambassador, Abd al-Wahid ben Masoud, and his retinue, who were working to refine the trade alliance between England, Elizabeth, and Morocco. Masoud brought Moroccan English captives with him and released them during his visit as a sign of goodwill. And one need not argue, as has inevitably been argued, that Masoud inspired or was the basis of the character Othello to see how the resonances and meanings of a fictive Moorish character could draw part of their force and take on new meanings from an audience's recent encounters with Moroccans, particularly a glamorous and powerful, and I think like all glamorous and powerful figures, a little bit threatening, promising a figure promising national benefit, or possibly withholding such national benefit too from the English. And similarly, the 1594 prosecution and execution of Rodrigo Lopez, the Portuguese doctor, convicted of attempting to poison his patient, Queen Elizabeth, has long been thought to figure into representations of Shylock's malice in The Merchant of Venice, although Shylock is not a poisoner or a doctor. Lopez, once Jewish, had converted to Catholicism in his native Portugal, and to the English who gleefully gathered to see him brutally executed, he figured at the same time the anti-English plots of Iberian Catholicism and the deceptive nature of crypto-Jews in England, right? So at the same time, you see he can figure two different racialized and feared groups in different ways that work together. So in early productions of Merchant or Othello, any number of rhetorical cues, dialogue elements, or costume elements might have signaled reference to these and other topical historical events. And casting and other choices of modern productions can likewise resonate with current topical issues, whether those in these plays, whether those issues relate to Jewishness and Black identity, or, for instance, the balance between a perceived external Muslim threat, such as the one that prompts the big opening voyage, military voyage to Cyprus in Othello, when the play reveals that the real threats to state order and to the main characters result from the deceptions of a nominal ally and friend, right? Malice from within. So while some of those meanings suggested in modern productions might not be ones that Shakespeare would directly recognize, the technique of enriching performances and adaptations with such topical reference will be identical in the two periods. 2, theatrical race draws on and improvises on larger histories, real and textual, associated with different groups. So again, Othello's Moorishness is ceaselessly discussed and constructed in Othello, and its meanings are rich and inconsistent. Yet Shakespeare's representations of Moorishness draw on its associations with real-life North African military power, in particular the power to help the English against their potent enemy, and again, not the Muslims in this case, but Spain. Yet Shakespeare also draws on the mixtures of truth and fancy found in travel narratives depicting magic and human monsters in Africa. So when Othello talks about men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders, that image is enriched by ideas of the kinds of strange creatures to be found in Africa, here illustrated in an earlier publication. In Merchant, Shylock and his daughter Jessica draw on a host of prior Jewish intertexts and associations from Christopher Marlowe's wildly successful predecessor play, The Jew of Malta. Run and read it if you haven't, which also features a Jewish father who loses his daughter to Christian suitors and Christian conversion, to associations of Jews with mercantilism, usury, and the literalistic and bloody values of the Hebrew Bible as it was understood in Christian London. Such intertextual and accumulative signifiers of race are among the easiest for modern literary critics to decipher and reflect on when we think about early productions of plays involving race and ethnicity. And it's harder sometimes for us to do that with references that may since have changed or that may have had radically different meanings in their own times. So we're trained to not do this, but we can easily unknowingly presume that racial meanings now were racial meanings then. And so one of the things you want to do is try and keep an open mind and learn from these texts and from the intertexts and contexts, possible differences and radical differences between racial organization then and now. But conversely, the most legible of such references, and others as well, can become the basis for modern productions to dwell on and restage and rethink in ways that we may talk about today. And third, last, a larger context of racial diversity and multiculturalism, both in real life and in a play, allows for the representations of different groups and individuals to draw on each other's significations and offer mutual fluid representations and racial analogies, figuring the fluidity of meaning that is a foundational component of all racial signification. It's no accident that these two example plays do not consider Moorishness or Jewishness in isolation, a single character, but rather are set in non-English locales and feature their own rich multicultural contexts. The settings of Venice, Cyprus, and Belmont give us Turks and Italians, Aragonese and Moroccan suitors, Scots, Frenchmen, and Germans, alongside the two plays' most racially marked Jewish and Moorish characters. Again, as with the demographic and geopolitical review with which I began, the relationships among and the meanings of these groups in Shakespeare do not always track with modern expectations. In Merchant, Portia mocks her English suitor, who is not presented as ethnically neutral and normative as we might expect, but as a cultural other in the play. However much The Merchant of Venice works to idealize its careless Venetian romantic leads, their casual cruelty, like Portia's pointedly racist dismissals of her non-Italian suitors, brilliantly shown in the recent OSF production, are shown as part and parcel of an enthusiasm for the values of Venetian gentility that insist on excluding all others. And here again, our American racial geography can find itself unexpectedly disoriented when Portia ridicules the Lord of Spanish Aragon as fully as and in parallel to the way she does the Prince of Morocco. And similarly, Othello's comparisons of himself at the end of his play to faithless Indians, I don't have a pointer, but sort of we've got Indians in line 2, and Turks near the 4 lines from the bottom, and his sudden references to Arabian and Syrian locales at the end of his, reveal the migratory power, circa 1601, of racial associations, which can easily transfer from one group to another, as they also can today. Here, they allow Othello to fleetingly move among and embody numerous different racial and ethnic profiles. A theatrical multicultural context seems to possess cumulative possibility for and in Shakespeare precisely by employing fluid racial associations and shifting racial reference. And again, modern race-conscious casting can activate such fluid associations in ways that might be particular to modernity, but can animate authentic energies in Shakespearean practice and text, as I'm suggesting. These energies insist on a diverse, signifying universe, figuring individual and community, race and ethnicity, in which, as here in Othello's speech, character self-definition, in part racial, is built through the ability to identify with and against a range of other identities. And these draw on real-world histories, but are not fully circumscribed by those histories. And rather, they generate new meanings and possibilities through the energy of performance and text. Now, one chief difference of modern companies from early modern ones is, of course, that we are no longer limited to presenting these roles exclusively via white male bodies, as in Shakespeare's time. So at this point, I'm going to stop and turn to our panelists who can talk more fully about that difference and its larger significance, and we'll move the conversation forward. Thank you.
You have to say, make it so.
Make it so. That's not Shatner.
Exactly.
He's more Shakespearean.
I think it's a direct shot, right? Direct shot?
There you go.
Yes, do you guys all just want to come up and I'll introduce you once you're here? I don't want to put you too much in the spotlight by giving an individual introduction. So let me just introduce, I'll start down there with Tyrone Wilson.
While I'm eating.
A key member of the OSF acting ensemble for 21 years, tackling a multitude of Shakespearean roles, including Mercutio, The Merchant of Venice, Caliban and the Tempest. He has also performed in such contemporary work as Blues for an Alabama Sky, Crumbs from the Table of Joy, and Ruined. He played the Reverend Ralph Abernathy in both All the Way and The Great Society. This season, you might have seen him as Bushy in Richard II, Lucianus in Hamlet. Tyrone holds a BA from Middlebury College and an MFA in acting from the Yale School of Drama.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Sounds also reduced.
Yes, these files are very much trimmed and don't begin to do full justice to our very distinguished panel here. I'm sorry. We go on and on if we really recounted all their
Oh,
accomplishments.
please.
Tiffany Lopez PhD is director of the School of Film, Dance, and Theater at Arizona State University. She has over 20 years of experience working as a community-engaged teacher and dramaturg devoted to developing theater artists. She's the founding artistic director of the Latino Play Project at the Culver Center for the Arts in Riverside, California, is a teaching artist for the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles, and a guest dramaturg for Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Her many awards include a Fulbright Fellowship and grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Ford Foundation, and Rockefeller Foundation. Welcome, Tiffany. Bill Rauch, Artistic Director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Since 2007, he's directed 23 productions. I guess I should be here. Who knew? Including this season's Roe and Richard II, both great productions. Previously, he served for 20 years as co-founder and artistic director of Cornerstone Theater Company. He directed All the Way on Broadway, which won the Tony Award for Best Play in 2014, and has mounted productions at virtually every major regional theater in America. His many awards include a Ford Fellowship, the Fick Andler, TCG's Visionary Leadership Award, and the Margot Jones Medal. Thank you, Bill. Kenneth Lee is a New York City-based actor and one of the founding members of the Asian American Performing Arts Coalition, which investigates Asian underrepresentation on American stages. In 2012, he took part in a panel discussion at La Jolla Playhouse when their production of The Nightingale, which is set in China, drew criticism for featuring only 2 Asian American actors in a cast of 12. Kenneth holds an MFA in acting from American Conservatory Theater and has performed professionally in a wide range of material. He has been in 9 productions of Hamlet and has played every age and gender-appropriate role in the play except the lead. Welcome, Kenneth. So I told the panelists that more than anything else, I was just very interested in how they wanted to address this question in any way, shape, or form. So the questions that I posed earlier are sort of optional, but I did think that maybe each of you should have an opportunity to speak briefly as individuals, 5 minutes or so. And I'd like to start with Bill. And you knew that was coming, didn't you? And again, if you want to work with that basic question that I posed of, how do we perceive race and diversity in a multicultural Shakespeare production? How do we perceive Shakespeare in the same? And that distinction between color conscious and color blind, I do think is really fascinating. But whatever you want.
But I do have to go first. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so great to be here. Do I need this? No. Yes? Are you on? Hello, hello. Is that better? So it's great to be here this afternoon with old and new friends on this panel, and I can't wait to hear from everybody else. But I will share a couple thoughts to kick us off. To me, colorblind, although it was a commonly used phrase for a while, I think is problematic. And it's a phrase that we try to not use at OSF in our casting process. Because to me, colorblind assumes that race and ethnicity don't matter. And that's, in fact, not the world that we live in. And I think that August Wilson, a long time ago now, wrote very famously about actors of color in Shakespeare essentially being asked to check their racial and ethnic identity at the door and essentially to play white people, and how problematic that was. And so I think that when you're creating a world on stage, you are creating a world, right, as a group of artists, and you can choose to create a world in which race and ethnicity don't matter, but that's a choice, and that's a very particular world that you're creating. And it can be a world where you're really investing in our shared humanity above all else. And I think that can be very powerful, but I don't think it's appropriate for every work of art. I don't think it's appropriate for every Shakespeare play. And I do think there's very slippery terrain in terms of essentially asking people of color to not bring who they are to bear with colorblind. So the phrase that we tend to use at OSF is color conscious, which means that you want to be thoughtful on a production by production basis and a role by role basis. And it's about, the play itself and the playwright's vision as much as you can determine it. The director's vision, the dramaturg's vision, and the actor's insights that you want to figure out how race and ethnicity come into play and are represented in a given production. We've certainly, over the last several years, maybe Tyrone, you'll talk a little bit about Comedy of Errors or Measure, or we have certainly experimented with culturally specific productions of Shakespeare. For instance, this season we have a production of The Winter's Tale that is performing on our outdoor stage with a large number of Asian American company members. The majority of the cast is Asian American, and that's a culturally specific approach. In the same way, when I directed Measure for Measure in 2011, that Ty was in, the starting premise of that production was every actor was bringing their racial and ethnic identity forward in some way in terms of the character. So Isabella was played by a Latina actress, and she was a Latina character, and her brother Claudio was a Latino man, and Tony Hill playing the Duke was a white man. So race and ethnic identity and gender were given with the characters, which may sound like that may not sound radical, but really starting with that was a strong place to start for that particular production. But I could talk a lot about other OSF productions, and I'm happy to talk more. I want to pause here and share the platform. But I do again, color consciousness is the phrase that we tend to use, knowing that every production and ultimately every role, there's going to be a different interplay between the reality of the actor's life and the character.
I can jump on that
Please.
for a sec, because I remember our conversation about Measure for Measure, and I think we ran into each other in the street, and Bill said, "Well, I wanted to come from a place." You talked about it either being someplace where that this black man, African American man, me, would make sense, would be right in that world. But I didn't have to confine myself to this country. And so I remember the only question I said, well, Bill, can we take him out of Nigeria? Because I've been in Africa for 2 seasons. So I remember we went back and forth and we settled on Jamaica. And that this character, Elbow, would be from Jamaica. And what was fascinating in working on it, and I don't know how many times this has happened, but in studying the dialect and there was a woman in the company who was from Jamaica, and I had several conversations with her about particularly where this character would exist in terms of the class, being a police officer. And looking at the Shakespeare lines and Elbow Shakespeare lines and what class he was in, she was reminded of her uncles who had the same sort of ideals about life, same sort of points of view. And she said, this is kind of a perfect match of dialect and this particular character, this set of characters' thoughts and feelings about the world.
What Shakespeare intended.
That's exactly. As we know, there were probably some Jamaicans hanging out in England at the time, man. and so I always thought it was so wonderful. And even when we were doing this speech stuff, the dialect stuff, some of the language kind of lent itself to the kind of language that we would expect from the character of Elbow. So I thought it was fascinating the way those worlds came together. And that's not the first time that that's happened. When we were doing Comedy of Errors, we set the play in Harlem Renaissance, 1920s Harlem. We changed very few words in that except for locations. So we were in Louisiana and upstate New York sometimes. But other than that, we just did the Shakespeare, and I like to say we did it with a flavor of being in Harlem in 1920s. And it was amazing to hear that language coming out of each other's mouths, looking at each other going, we are in the Harlem Renaissance, but we're speaking words that were written over 400 years ago. And we didn't have any problems with putting that together, to believing in that fully. So I love when it comes together like that, and for the most part, I think it does. I did actually answer two of the questions, and I think they actually tie in. And one of them, how does an audience perceive a Shakespeare play? It's interesting because I think, when I go to see a play, many times I hardly think about, that there's this actor playing this or this actor of color playing this, unless the production wants me to think about it. If they want me to think about it. When the production wants me to think about it, if you cast an African-American actor, for example, in the role of Caliban, and you are consciously crafting the concept to make a statement about an issue about an African-American being in that particular relationship to this guy who's taken the island away from him, then I'm going to think about the fact that that's an African American actor playing that role, because you wanted me to. But with roles like Caliban, because of who Caliban is, even if you don't make that the point, if you cast a black actor, I'm going to think about it anyway, because here it is, a guy who's a servant. And given our past relationship with master and servant, oppressed and repressed, if I see a black actor who's playing Caliban and a white actor who's playing Prospero, that's where I'm going to go, or I'm going to think about that. It's just natural. I think that the more time that passes between when the play is originally written and the present time, audiences tend to get less stuck with that. But I think we're at that time where we're stuck sometimes. How do actors of color approach these roles and experience performance? I had a friend of mine named Reggie Cathy. When I first got out of grad school, I ran into him in New York, and he was already auditioning in New York. He had auditioned for a big film with John Landis. And he goes in, he had just gotten out of Yale Drama School. He goes in and he does a general audition. He auditions with Shakespeare, and John Landis says, oh yeah, that's sounding nice. You don't know John Landis is a big film director. And then he auditions with a Chekhov piece. And John Landis says, yeah, do you have anything black? And Reggie Cathy looked at him and said, everything I do is black. Now, I think about that sentence and that story about every 3 or 4 months. Every 3 or 4 months, I bring to the role my life experiences, those experiences are shaped by many factors. One of those variables includes being African American, who was born in North Carolina, grew up in New York City, went to Middlebury College in Vermont, and Yale Drama School, who lives in Southern Oregon with 2 biracial children, one's mother who is Hawaiian, and the other woman who's white, comes from a pioneer family who was here for 200 years. I play golf, I climb mountains. My approach to the role is all of those experiences. Every role I do is black because that's how I define myself, right? My moment-to-moment experience on stage is my character reacting to the circumstances of that play being developed during the rehearsal process. For the most part, in a Shakespeare play, that experience is a result of crafting those moments with the director and my fellow actors. And we were doing, Bill directed us in Richard II, and we had a moment in the play, I didn't know if you even knew this conversation was going on, but you were part of the conversation, we had the jousting scene. And so, of course, we're on the side going, how are we going to have jousting in a play where most of us are in modern costumes, but these guys are going to come on in armor? How do we reconcile that? And so Jeff King and I, who are Star Trek fans, were having a conversation, and I said, remember Jeff in Amok Time? When Spock goes back to Vulcan and he has to fight using these ancient instruments, and then they settle their differences and then they go back on the ship. It's kind of like that. And we both went home and watched Amok Time that night, came back the next day and we said, now we're reconciled. We can see people coming on stage, us in modern costumes and then with armor, because we know this is Amok Time. You see, there are black Vulcans, okay? So to me, it's what you decide it is going to be. That's how you define yourself. That's how you define who you are in the production, because you're creating it because it's theater and because you can use your imagination. And you're hoping that every audience member is doing the same thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. There's so much to say. One of the things that I think is really incredible about the environment here in Ashland and through OSF is that they are thinking about building the work from what their engagement with their audience, with their community stakeholders, with what the actors have to say about the season, with what the person in the box office has to say, with all the various relationships. And I think for the last couple of years, I've been very privileged to be trusted to be a kind of fly on the wall in some very deep conversations around arts equity, a lot of closed door conversations, really being able to talk about some of the impact of the work on people of color and on the ground and building the work, but also been able to see from the position of being a guest dramaturg, writing for Illuminations, and this year working with Mojada and the team building Luis Alfaro's play for the season, to be privy to these really incredible conversations where people are thinking about the impact of the work, they're thinking about questions about identity, but they're also thinking about excellence and the storytelling and how we convey the storytelling. In the academic world, in the world of higher education, I'm in the pipeline of the creative process here and helping to train young actors and dramaturgs, where the questions that are being asked here at OSF are not, they're light years ahead of how they're talking about race here than what I even see in higher education. And I think I want to share a couple of stories to kind of put a face on, well, what happens when you don't ask these questions, or we're not empowering the next generation of artists to ask these questions. And we know right now diversity matters because our population is becoming increasingly diverse. We might be in a room with who appears to be all white retirees and assume that they don't care about race and diversity, but actually that's so wrong because those are their grandkids, right? And their family photos look like the casting in the world of the Shakespeare plays at OSF. These are snapshots of how our family photos have evolved. So, and when I've done conversations here, it's been incredible to see where audiences want to go in talking about diversity in casting. But it's been very curious to me within the institution of higher education, training MFA students, training young undergraduates, doing work at institutions that are Hispanic serving, and how that ability to talk about how do we talk about race? How do we talk about diversity? We did a play called Detained in the Desert by a playwright, Tiffany Lopez, and it's about immigration and detention. And the Latina actress, young Latina actress who is rehearsing the role, she started to cry during rehearsal. And somebody asked her, "Oh, are you just overwhelmed by the storytelling about immigration, about detention?" And she said, "No. I've been a Latina actor training through high school, through junior high. Here I am in college. This is the first time I've ever had the opportunity to play somebody from my own culture, and I have no idea how to go about it. I feel alienated from my own culture," because none of these conversations had ever been part of her training as a young actor coming into play. Another story I want to share is about a young actor. His name is Cesar Ortega. He did some work for Cornerstone, and now he's an independent theater artist. But he was a student in my class. He's from Mexico. He immigrated during high school. He has a very thick accent. He is one of the most amazing actors, theater makers, community engaged artists that I had seen in my 20 years of teaching at the University of California. And we were doing a table read of Short Eyes. And I asked him to come up and play a character in Short Eyes. And he said, Profe, I don't know if I can do this because of my accent. I said, "No, this is going to be brilliant. You're bringing something to this that, trust me, everybody in the room is going to go deeper into the play because of you and what you're bringing to the role." And he read of the role of Paco, Cupcakes, and that day completely changed his life. He said, "I realized I've been living and not sharing my art and not speaking because I felt ashamed. I believed that I couldn't be an actor, I couldn't be a theater artist to maximum potential because of my accent. And now I see that, no, it brings something really powerful to what I'm going to do." And he went on to graduate and do really incredible things. So, these are examples of what happens for young people when they're not in a world where the conversations that we're having in this room aren't part of their education, and how does that play out in the pipeline to what is going to happen 10, 20 years later with our artistry in this country. So that's a way to share about why this is so important, why these questions. I think the last thing I want to put on the table for us to think about is there can be a huge distance between intention and impact. And I've also seen several productions where guest directors will come in and they'll have a concept about setting a work in Mexico, for example. Well, what happens when the cast is not cast with Latino actors? What happens to that concept? They don't revise the concept. It ends up becoming very offensive. It ends up that race and culture are a prop. It ends up everything goes awry that you can think of. And then what happens when there's no way to talk about it, to shape it, to change it? Something I'm doing working with young artists at Arizona State University is, it was just a table reading for a new script where three white males wrote the script. It's a border story. They talked about, the intent with the work. The script was so problematic. I felt socked in the gut at the end of the reading. It was a moment where the impact had gone so awry from what they intended. They didn't realize the history of stereotypes and offense that they were actually engaging with their characters. So at that point, there's two things that I and the other collaborators on the dramaturgical team can do. We can either voice the problem with it and we all leave the room, or we sit and talk and make a commitment to, well, now what? And what has come out of that is we're developing an incubation laboratory where we're fostering young artists who really want to be ethical storytellers, to get things right, to talk about race and culture, that they can have a safe space to where they can risk failing. They can risk offense, but we can put these questions on the table so that we can really foster the next generation storytellers that want to get these things right, not just for the actors of color that are on stage, but for the storytellers who may not be from those communities, but realize that they live in this incredibly diverse world and need to be responsible to the world they live in and know how to get things right and how they're portraying diversity, race, and different communities. So, I just want to share some of those anecdotes with you, and also to talk, just to say how important this conversation is, and how privileged we are to have access to a space like OSF, where what we see on stage is evolving out of some really groundbreaking, forward-thinking, exemplary conversations about race, diversity, and casting. So thank you.
Wow, everybody's like covered everything that I wanted to say, and so eloquently too. I just wanted to piggyback on your point about the Latino, the three white writers who wrote about the Latino experience. And I think one of the tendencies that we have as a society is to find a fix for that. And it seems now that the conversation goes, for instance, in Hollywood, that, yeah, well, we'll find a Latino person to write the script next time. And that's the extent of our conversation. And I like that you mentioned, let's develop a whole process. Let's develop the dialogue. Let's actually get to the core, because kind of like what you were talking about, the Latino actress who seemed so disconnected from her experience. Just because somebody is a person of color should not then be expected to carry the burden of all the knowledge and the background and the culture of that race or that ethnicity. So we cannot skip that process. So that's the primer. So thanks for having me. I wanted to say thanks also to Bill and your work at OSF. I was able to see The Winter's Tale. And I wanted to share a story about how seeing an Asian lead in a Shakespeare play moved me tremendously. And it made me feel like, oh, that's what I've been missing. And I thought, wow, we got to do better by our younger kids of color. Because it's really, really, really important for young people who are in the process of developing who they are to see reflections of themselves. I don't remember, it was Mary Shelley maybe who said something like, you want to turn somebody into a monster, deny them a reflection of themselves. And I think as artists, all of us in the panel, and, and consumers of art, I think we have a responsibility to transcend that. And to make to, as it were, in Hamlet, everybody has a connection with Hamlet here, hold a mirror up to life and show people who they are. So to that extent, what you talked about, Tyrone, I really enjoyed as well about, I am me. I don't know any other than me. And what I bring to the stage is me. So, when somebody says, can you be more Asian or more black? I kind of don't know what that means. But I can give you an example of that may help us flip the page a little bit. So there's a theater company in New York that, because of this, diversity initiative, has decided to curate a season of plays that is interesting. So one of them is, I think it's a Brecht, and it's set in the Congo. So it's an all-black cast. And then there's another play called Pacific Overtures, and it's an all-Asian play. And I think it's a musical, and it's an entirely Asian cast. I think there is another one by Goldoni, I'm not sure. And And the fourth one was Dead Poets Society. And they just released the cast list, and it was an all-white cast. And so in the context of this, I thought it was very interesting to have that dialogue, because not only are we sort of segregating them, but also because if the Brecht was a commentary on Congo and the blackness, and Pacific Overtures was a commentary on Asians, then Dead Poet Society would be a commentary on whiteness, right? So what is that saying about whiteness? And that's how I watch plays. Why is this cast all white? Why did it have to be all white? And to your point, Bill, what you said was so spot on about consciousness and being aware that that is a choice, that everything is a choice, that if you have a production of 12 Angry Men, or in the context of what we're talking about in Shakespeare, an all-white production of, I don't know, The Tempest, or Cymbeline, or whatever, you are making a commentary. And what that is, we should hold you to account as consumers of artists. Why? Why this choice? Every single element, and directors can speak to that. Every single element that is put on stage, from the mise-en-scène to the props, to the language, to the dialects, to the costumes, everything is a choice, which is kind of what Tyrone talked about, is what if I were the director, is what I want you to see. So the cast is a choice. And that goes to the color-conscious casting, I think. And with that, I guess I'm done.
Some of the interesting issues have come up, and I do want the audience to have a chance to ask questions, but we have a lot of time. So I wonder, Bill, could I ask you just a sort of a follow-up to the distinction you drew between color conscious and colorblind? Would you be willing to talk a little bit more about specific productions, yours or other OSF artists that you felt were, you talked about Measure for Measure, you and Tyrone, I thought that was a great example. Are there others where you think we could really see that clear difference between color conscious and colorblind?
Well, I have a story. First of all, I was thinking on your comments there that an all-white cast is a choice too. I think it's the mistake we make when people think white is neutral, right? Like white is neutral, and then actors of color are not neutral, and that's a supremely white supremacist way of looking at the world, right? What white is not neutral. What white is another identity and another way of moving through the world. So I was just thinking about that a lot and what you're saying. Well, this is a really long ago story, but I think it's a valuable story. I was directing Cornerstone, my former theater that Tiffany referenced. I was directing a production of Three Sisters. It was a community-based adaptation in a coal mining community in West Virginia. And the play was called Three Sisters from West Virginia. And the Three Sisters were played by a white woman who was in real life a coal miner's daughter whose dad had died of black lung, and she wrote a song about her dad that we worked into the play. And then a member of my company who was also white, who was playing the middle sister. And then the youngest sister was played by a local college student who was African American. And, we never, because, hopefully we grow as artists over the years, right? So at that time in my development as an artist, we didn't discuss the fact that two sisters were white and one was black. We didn't talk about it. And finally, somebody said, okay, I got a question. Okay, how come, no, it was her. It was Trina who was playing the youngest sister. And she said, my friends are all giving me a hard time at school because I'm black and the play's called Three Sisters and my sisters are white and they've made jokes like, are you the black sheep of the family? And, I don't know what to say to them. So I took a deep breath and I did really one of the most eloquent speeches I'd ever made in my life about race being an artificial social construct, which is true, right? And the shared humanity, and we're all, and I really sweated and worked through this whole speech and felt really good. And then Wanda, who was playing the older sister, went, oh, well, Amy Jo, Doc Childers, the character who's playing the doctor, he's black, and he's always talking about how much you remind him of our mama and how much you look like her. So I thought it was really obvious that, mom and dad had us, and then mom had an affair with the doc, and that's where you come from, and we don't ever talk about it in the family, but we understand, we treat, you're our real sister, even though biologically you're a half-sister. And Amy, who was playing the young sister, looked at me with complete contempt and said, that's an answer. But here is the messed up thing. I had cast Doc Childers with that backstory in mind. But I didn't feel safe talking about it at my 23-year-old self, right? I felt like somehow talking about that was, which is, I'm embarrassed to admit that, right? But that was a huge moment of education in terms of colorblind versus color conscious in that particular production. And I think really what that actor was saying was within the world of Chekhov's play as adapted and being about us West Virginians, it is not a neutral fact that I am black. And so don't ask me to pretend that that's some neutral fact that doesn't have any impact on my relationship with the other characters on stage. It was a big moment.
And I love that story, right? Because we are sitting here and get to know the distance between the journey of your career, the moment you were and the young director and who you are today. And look at how powerful it is that you've taken the way you thought then and externalized it and made it part of the choices, the conversations about choices. Rather than when you don't talk about it, it's unspeakable. Oh, it's unspeakable. We're not supposed to talk about race. It's unspeakable. And for, I think, people of color, that unspeakableness becomes part of the other range of unspeakable things we deal with, which is it becomes traumatic. The stories I told about my students, it's traumatic to carry that around, that you can't talk about it. I was thinking about last year I was working with a student who was auditioning for the ERDAs to get into MFA programs in acting, and he was putting together his portfolio of work to talk about what he should do. He loved doing Shakespeare, and my advice to him, thinking strategically about, okay, we're not yet there yet about how people are going to read him. He's Afro-Latino. I said, you're going to have to create two pieces, one that they clearly see you doing, like, oh yeah, we see him doing that role, and one that completely blows them away and stretching their imagination. But you're going to stretch their imagination by getting them to just legibly see you as an actor. And so his audition was to do the rehab counselor played by Chris Rauch in Motherfucker with a Hat. And so he did that role, but then he did a piece from Shakespeare. And he did Motherfucker with a Hat first, and then he did the other role, and everyone was completely blown away. But he had to thank you. He had to strategically think about, how do I get seen as an actor? And strategically create those roles. So I think the whole notion, and that's him thinking about his participation in making choices, but then what do you do with the next step about the other choices, and how do we stretch audiences in theaters, which is something I'm really thinking about is, as audiences, how do we come into the room? When I was working on the Illuminations Guide for River Bride last year, one of the challenges we had was talking about magical realism. Magical realism, that play has nothing to do with magical realism. Not all Latino writers, their work is magical realist. No. But the feedback was saying, people are going to see the certain magical fairy tale qualities, and because it's a Latino writer, they're going to think it's magical realism. But that became a really great opportunity for us to talk about it's not, and why it's not, and what it means that every Latino writer, playwright, is struggling with this burden that if they do something fantastical, everybody just thinks it's part of a magical realism Latin American lineage. So there's so much for us to be grappling with. But I think that whole notion of choice, that's such a potent part of this conversation. I really appreciate your raising that.
I wonder, also, Tyrone and Kenneth, as trained actors, I wonder, looking back on your own experience being trained as actors and hearing Tiffany talk about her work with actors, do you have anything to say about how it was for you in terms of whether multicultural classic acting was even addressed? I mean, was there any conversation about color consciousness in your training, or was it just sort of you were treated like everybody else? I'm just curious about that in terms of what Tiffany's bringing up.
Well, it's definitely, there was no difference in treatment in terms of my training. I wasn't taken to the special room. The African American actors go to this room to study Shakespeare. It's nothing of that nature, or even suggested that you were going to have a different route. I can only remember my own story. I got into theater because in high school, I just did I was a goofy kid. Like everybody else, I'm a goofy kid. And they said, you ought to be on stage. And they didn't say, you could be the next black comedian or anything like that. They just said, you wear a funny hat, and I bet you would be great on stage. And so my first show was gospel. The story is very similar. When I got to actually training as an actor, when I started really doing theater in college, my first show in college was Brecht, was Three Penny Opera, and then we did The Tempest, and we did Raisin in the Sun my senior year, my junior year, because I was the only one at Middlebury College who could play the role of Walter Lee. We just barely got enough people together to do The Family, I directed a production of Colored Girls and literally had like 2 or 3 colored girls drop out because they weren't actors. They were English majors. Not that you couldn't be an actor and be an English major. But it was really, I was acting in the moment of what's available, and my training was about the fact that I was there and I was available to receiving. And what I was receiving at the moment was these experiences of doing Brecht. I didn't really start doing African-American plays by African-American playwrights until, again, Raisin Samba, after I graduated from college. When I got to grad school, and then certainly professionally until after I got out. So the training is about training me to be an actor. That's what it was. It was about being an actor and always being reminded to just bring what you had, your personalization to the role. I mean, there are roles that I have taken where I have certainly brought being black into the role, and some would never even know that that's where the source was. There's a little moment in Richard II, actually, that's become very special to me. But everybody on stage knows. But the other day I did this moment, and I walked off stage and I said to Jonathan Topo, I think I was doing Joe Pesci just then. You know? And it varies. Like, it's Joe Pesci or it's like, you know, Sam Jackson. It just depends on what I need for that moment. And for me, again, it's about going back to the first thing I said. It's about what I need in that particular moment. When I was doing Two Trains Running, and it's a black character written by a black playwright, August Wilson, but there was a lot of that role which was about observation of people that I met when I worked in a mental hospital who were white. So I was being sourced by crazy white behavior. You know? So I mean, I know what you mean by the question of, you know, was there any difference? It's not what you mean, but, you know, but really it's what's available, it's what's useful, and it's up to others to define what that is. I mean, I'm going to define it as being useful for me in the moment. And I myself can't even tell you whether or not I'm sourcing from something that's being primarily influenced by the fact that I'm a black American. I don't know in all its details whether or not that's true. I only know that it's truthful for me in that moment to source that. You know.
In my first semester of grad school, the artistic director sat me down and she said, okay, so we're going to give you a scene written by David Henry Hwang to practice on, because we know that moving forward with a class of other people of color and white people, that we're probably not going to be able to cast you in your specific ethnicity. So that was the accommodation specifically that she gave me. But instead of an accommodation, I found that an exciting challenge, like an opportunity. I got to learn so much more than my white classmates, because I have to transcend myself and dig deeper into what it means for me to be human, over and over and over again with every different show and with every different character. And that meant stretching a lot more than I was used to. My third semester, I did the Beau Stratagem. You know, what's that? And I thought that was part and parcel of, you know, my education. What I found interesting, though, was when I was in school, there was no question about color conscious or colorblind casting. We did Blue Window, we did the Chekhov. Family members were all of different colors. When I graduated, suddenly for some I can't explain what reason, I'm not considered for any family members in any Shakespeare play. Like, so if there were, you know, family relations, I can just about forget playing Sebastian unless Viola was Asian. Well, that's a good reason because they're twins, but but bad example. You get my point. So that's something that I found different in the industry. That is a disparity from my education, and I think that goes to imagination. I think we underestimate the imagination of our audiences, and as artists, it's our job to push people to imagine further and much, much more.
That's good. Can I jump in? I just wanted to say something as we talk about OSF and progress. You know, this year 60% of the acting company are actors of color. Next year, I think it's 63%. So it's
First time in history.
to have the majority of actors be actors of color. But this is something that's been built over decades. And the first actors of color at OSF appeared decades and decades ago, many decades ago. And
had to hide. They had to kind of be hidden a little bit within the company. They couldn't walk around by themselves in town. That's how long ago it was.
yes, right,
Yeah.
right. And so many previous artistic directors and artistic staffs, just my predecessor alone, Libby Apple, and Tim Bond as her associate artistic director, and then Penny Metropolis, the work that they did. So we all stand, in all of our efforts, right, stand on the shoulders of all those who've come before us who have just done extraordinary things to make progress possible. So I wanted to say that. And I wanted to say one of the things we sweat the most at the casting table, there are 5, 6 of us who cast any given season, and casting the plays is one thing, and it's very, very challenging, as you can imagine. But then where the discussion has become more heated and more energized in the last couple of years is understudy casting. Because it's one thing if it's, again, not a fan of the phrase, but for argument's sake, colorblind, right? And everybody's just everything and it's all cool, then anybody can understudy anything. But when you start building productions, if you've got a new play where it's written to the fabric of the play, the race of the character, that's one thing. If you build a Shakespeare play, right, where you start building a production that's based on racial identity or ethnic identity, then you have to start having the understudies correspond. And we have enormous, heated debates about when it is appropriate or not appropriate to have that racial consonants or, just any number, does the understudy need to match the age, the exact skill set, the gender, the race, and, in a musical, the understudies need to sing, right? That's straightforward. But there's so many really kind of tightrope walk decisions and, decisions that we absolutely regret making from over the years. Where it felt like that would be fine, and then like, oh, this is not fine at all. So anyway, I just want to name that as a particular challenge at OSF with the rep company.
I think of a play, I think about Sweat, like Carlo Alban, his role in Sweat, even though he doesn't speak a lot in that play, line-wise, he's speaking volumes, his physical character on that play. It's like you have to look at that and his identity and who he is in the context of the play. It means it's in the fabric of the work, whether it's explicit in the text or not. That seems like that. I mean, would that be a key example of what you're talking about? I'm thinking about understudy for that role.
Sure, but let's say Carlo's in a Shakespeare play. How much is his identity as a young Latino man become part of the fabric of his role in the Shakespeare play? And do we have a moral imperative or an artistic imperative? Do we owe it to the audience? Do we owe it to him? Do we owe it to the fellow actors that the actor understudying him is also Latino? And, we kind of take it on a case-by-case basis, but we're making judgment calls, and sometimes those judgment calls are everybody lives with, and then sometimes they're really questioned.
Well, we had the case in Comedy of Errors.
Yes.
When one of the twins were, and they were African-American twins, had to be.
Yes.
And then the understudy question of,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
do you understudy them with a white actor?
For the body double.
Yeah, for the body
Yes,
double.
Yes.
For the body double.
Well, in fairness to that one, but that was a train wreck.
Yeah.
And in fairness, it's because there were no body doubles. when
Yes.
we cast originally. So we cast a young white man who was understudying a role that I forget exactly how the
Rames's
math of it worked,
role.
but then they became body doubles, and we like in the like late in the process, we're like, wait a minute, we got a white guy doing the body double of a black. This is a nightmare. This is a nightmare. And we had to fix it fast.
Yes. Yes.
And that's also the way works of art evolve, and productions, especially of classics, evolve over the course of the rehearsal process.
Yeah.
And so you may intend one thing at the casting table and then end up with a really different
In reality,
situation.
yeah.
Thank you for the little PTSD there.
It's close to my heart.
Tyrone, could I ask you about playing Caliban? You know, Caliban is described in the dramatis personae as a savage and deformed slave.
Yeah.
And you were talking about playing Caliban. I think you were actually talking about it as a spectator. When you see Caliban played by an African American, you expect that to be integral to the characterization.
Yeah.
What about your own performance, and how do you deal with the fact that as scripted, his trajectory is perhaps really disappointing if we want to see him as a rebel who's trying to reclaim his territory?
Well, Prospero leaves. and I say that in a joking way, like, you know, I get something. But I mean, if I'm going to play the role, I'm going to find some sort of positive trajectory for myself. Something about it that I'm going to get by the end of it, even though Shakespeare may not be giving it to me entirely, or it may not be what the audience wants, especially today. It's interesting. A fellow African-American actor friend of mine said that there should be a moratorium on black people playing Caliban for at least 10 years until we can figure out another way of doing this, the noble savage. And I think because, I played it 20-some years ago. It was one of my first roles here, and I played it in college. I've always, you know, I know what's written about it. I know what he's being called by other characters, but I can't concern myself with that. I mean, I again, in the moment-to-moment playing of it is a human being, you know, and I'm playing out human moments, and I understand those human moments, and I understand those struggles moment to moment. The bigger questions, watching from an audience point of view, is only my concern if I can't reconcile myself to playing that role. If I make a decision that I'm going to play that role, then I'm going to commit myself to it fully, and I'm going to bring as much heart to it as possible. And I don't need to convince myself. I don't need to go, oh my gosh, I got to go play Caliban again. I'm going to debase myself. I got to be slavish. I mean, I don't go through that. You know, I make the decision. If it's up in the docket, I'm going to play that role. I'm going to sign that contract, and I'm going to play that role. And I'm going to I don't even need to find a way. All I got to do is read the part and know that I'm in it. And it's me, and then I'm going to work with the director to try to see what their point of view, their vision is. I'm going to fit myself into that, or help them to guide them to a smarter version that I have. But I mean, we're going to work it out, and I'm going to leave the arguments to those who need to argue about it.
Kenneth, I have a feeling that some of us would be intrigued to hear more about your organizations having called out La Jolla Playhouse and you got involved with the panel. What was the outcome of that? How did the conversation go?
The outcome of that, in short, is that La Jolla Playhouse this year has a runaway hit called Tiger Style, which is all Asian. So kudos to La Jolla Playhouse. This was what I meant by the discourse. We can't skip that process step. We can't just say, well, let's just program, an Asian play or some token play and then call it a day. We had a process. We had a conversation. And I just wanted to talk a little bit to what you were talking about, the moratorium on Caliban. I don't remember the website right now, but there is actually a website that speaks of characters in Shakespeare's canon that POC can play, people of color can play, and then there are those that they can't play. So the ceilings are still being shattered. Like Titania and Oberon can be played by black people too. Caliban can be played by black people. But there are other characters that just can't. They haven't been shattered. I haven't. It was a jokey anecdote, but it's true. I have never been auditioned for Hamlet. So that's the implicit thing. And the final thing I wanted to say was about dramaturgical rigor. I think, to your point about La Jolla Playhouse and The Nightingale, I think it was a cast of 12. There were 2 Asian actors. There were 5 white men in the cast. And one of the white men played the Emperor of China. And that's just dramaturgically problematic. I'm so glad Lara presented that wonderful presentation because it gave us some context of the landscape of what was going on. But it also made us reckon with contextual analysis right now. The fact right now is that Asian Americans are underrepresented on stages. So, comedians usually say, you always punch down, you never punch up. So you can always take authority, you can always challenge authority, but you don't punch down to the people that are disaffected. And I think there's some practical application to this. We are an underrepresented community, and the optic of a white male king of China is damaging. It just is. No matter how you slice it. I mean, they said it was a myth, a mythic China. And in an ideal world, let's be fair. In an ideal world where everything was already, fair and on par, then great, have at it. Let talent win. But we all know that meritocracy is a myth. And the sooner we reckon with that, the quicker we can get to the better parts of the diversity discourse.
Yeah.
And I also want to thank Laura for providing us with that context, because in a lot of ways, that's what we're doing in our day and age, is getting more in touch with how context matters. So it's not just talking about race and diversity for the sake of race and diversity. I think it's really about an enhanced conversation about the context of the world we live in. I was reading a blog essay. I cannot remember the name of the scholar who wrote it, but she's from New Zealand, and she was talking about how in 2013, and the cusp of the global celebration of Shakespeare, in which 37 countries were doing 37 different productions of Shakespeare and coming together to showcase the work, I believe in the UK, that at that same moment, New Zealand's education board decided they were no longer going to teach Shakespeare in the high schools because it wasn't really relevant to the lives of young people, that they didn't really directly connect with it. And her essay is a marvelous argument for how actually it's more relevant to our students now than ever before, looking at the context of immigration, looking at class struggles, looking at gender dynamics, looking at how families are changing, looking at perceptions of what a community should be and what a community actually is in practice, looking at historical legacies and personal legacies of trauma. All of these things are in Shakespeare. And when when we were talking earlier, he gave this example of, I believe, grade schoolers being given Hamlet and a young female student sitting down and immediately not only picking up the discourse and gleefully embracing it, but coming into awareness as she did her cold read about what the story was actually about and becoming really moved.
It was called the Hobart Shakespeareans, PBS.
They come to
Hobart.
OSF every year.
Yeah.
The kids come.
Amazing.
And
They were
they
amazing.
and they perform on the Green Show stage often. They're
On
amazing.
PBS.
So context is everything.
I just want to say something about Shakespeare for a minute. I have directed a lot of Shakespeare plays. I've been very lucky, very blessed that I've gotten to direct so many. I always say I would direct anything written by William Shakespeare anytime, and I mean it. And every time I was so scared to direct Richard II, as Tyrone knows. I confessed that in my playbill notes as director, and I had an incredible experience. So I love, 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 love the writing. But I have flashes of real issues with this guy. I've got to say, like whether it's about class and that all the noble characters get to speak in elevated verse, but anybody who's working class has to speak in prose because working class people couldn't possibly speak in verse. Like, I struggle with that sometimes. I struggle with, well, we can have all this gender play and we can have a woman, flirting with a woman, but once everything's exposed, everybody's going to go back to a very heterosexual world, right? I struggle with, although I've defended many times Shakespeare was not anti-Semitic, and Shylock is that character is a study in the corrosive effects of anti-Semitism in society. Shakespeare was not racist. I do think his humanity. He sees humanity in every character he created. But then we have 2-to-1 male to female actors still in our company in 2016. Why? Because William Shakespeare wrote so freaking many male characters and so few female characters. And I understand that was the fact that the companies were all male, and I get it. But I yes.
But it's not true, right? Other playwrights wrote more female characters.
Than Shakespeare did.
Shakespeare
Sure.
can't be performed, after the theaters are reopened in 1660 when Ben Jonson and Bowman and Fletcher can be, and Webster, because there's female actors on the stage now and everyone wants to see them, and Shakespeare doesn't have the parts, and he can only be performed when they start adding in female parts. So it really is something about him and not the time period, which I think is important. Sorry to cut you off.
No,
because
I'm
you're saying
grateful.
important
I'm
things.
grateful.
Yeah.
So my ultimate point is I love the work of William Shakespeare. I'm happy Shakespeare is our middle name. And we have real challenges to create true equity, diversity, and inclusion in terms of gender identity and gender and sexuality and race and ethnicity and all sorts of things because of challenges that are inherent in the texts. And we have to be able to say that too, even in our love of the playwright, I think. That was tepid applause, guys. That was tepid. that was. I don't know if I accept that point. That's what that was. But it seemed like it was supposed to get applause.
Maybe somebody should have had an affair. Like the story with, he had an affair, so that's how
I
the
see.
sister
Yes,
was.
so that's the end. Three sisters.
Well, it's interesting because my next question, Bill, is actually going to be, can you look in the future and think about how you'll continue to be the standard bearer as you already are? Can you go even further with this commitment to diversity and multicultural Shakespeare? You've kind of commented on it a little bit. Is there anything else you want to say? I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but
I hope, as long as I'm lucky to be a temporary caretaker of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and its 82-year history, I want to keep hiring artists as directors, as dramaturgs, as actors, who are going to keep challenging the limits of my vision, right? And keep have people say, yes, but. I mean, it's really interesting we've talked so much about Caliban, because I'll cop to this right now. The last time we did The Tempest, you'll remember Wayne Carr played Caliban. He played it beautifully, but I fought at the casting table. I fought for two reasons to have Wayne play the role. One was Tony Taccone, the director, had a vision about the character being played by a black actor.
Yep.
The last two, maybe three times, white actors had played Caliban,
Yep.
partly because of The Trap, right? I know Dan
Yes.
Donahue played it, John Pribble played it, and maybe you were the one before
I
that?
was the one before
Okay,
that,
so
yeah.
two times it had been a white actor. So the director had a vision for it being a black character, and the actor, Wayne himself, came into my office and said, playing Caliban is a reason for me to come back next season.
Yeah.
And so I was moved by both those things. But I had really smart colleagues who were like, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. I do not want to have a black Caliban. I do not want to reinforce the slave as black man, the noble savage. And they fought against it. And we debated and we debated. In the end, we went for it. And I have to say, with huge respect to the production and to Wayne's beautiful performance, by the end of the season, I had more ambivalence about the casting choice than I did when I made it. I really did. I will be honest.
Yeah.
And one of Tyrone's esteemed colleagues did not want to, refused to understudy the role.
Yeah.
A black actor in the company would not take on the assignment of
Yeah.
understudying the role. And I think that I was, and I'm not saying, I'm a big believer in never saying never again about anything, right? But I don't think we followed through on the promise opportunity of casting a black actor in that role as quite as effectively as I hoped we would when we cast it.
Yeah.
And so that was a painful one. Wayne playing Pericles the next year was a joy because what you're talking about, right? Pericles might be one of those roles where you wouldn't, right, have an actor of color necessarily because it's the title role, yada, 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 in the tradition in American theater. And Wayne was so brilliant in that role.
Yeah.
So that was just an interesting,
Yeah.
contrasting experiences.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we should entertain some questions from the audience. I'm sure there must be a lot. Yeah, right there.
Question. I want to think about this from the point of view, this particularly from you, Bill, but anybody else, of the audience. And how do you educate the audience to understand the color conscious casting, what it means, including that when you cast a white person, that's color conscious?
Yeah.
How do you educate us in a town that, let's face it, despite the view of this room, is mostly old white farts like me?
You know, one of the things I think is powerful about theater is it teaches us to become comfortable with our discomfort. And I think one of the most important things for an audience to be in touch with is their own discomfort. And what is your discomfort about? Is your discomfort when you see something about this is completely turning upside down what I expect the characters in this world to be, and why are you uncomfortable with it? Is it because you've always been expecting that it's going to be cast a certain way, or is it really touching something personal that you need to get in touch with? You know, I think to me that's like when audiences ask, well, what can we do? I think it's to be really in touch with what is your discomfort about.
And why?
And why? Like, what is the source of your discomfort? Why are you having that discomfort? And that right there, that helps us to go to another level.
When Libby Apple, my predecessor, directed King Lear in one of her early seasons, King Lear's three daughters were played by a black woman, a white woman, and a South Asian woman. And Libby had enormous pushback from the audience about actors of color in Shakespeare, and especially families that were, not biologically possible or not realistic. Now, I say this as the white father of two children of color, right? So, but huge pushback. When I started as artistic director, not a peep about actors of color in Shakespeare at all. huge pushback about actors of color in American classics. How could Marion the librarian in River City, Iowa be black? How could Marion be, and how could, and Mrs. Peru is white? Well, actually, Demetra Pittman was not white. She was actually a woman of color, including part African American. But, or our town, there was huge pushback about actors of color in our town. How can Emily Webb be South Asian? How can her mom be black? How can her dad be white? So it's interesting that the location of the resistance had shifted, that it wasn't about Shakespeare anymore, that people expected to see actors of color in Shakespeare. It was about an American classic, and that was where there was both a sense of ownership and a sense of limitations. So it's interesting to think, what is 50 years ahead? Will there be multiracial productions of August Wilson? And is that, that's hard for us to imagine. It's hard for me to imagine. But that may be the dialogue that the community will be having with itself 50 years from now. So it's interesting to me to think about it as a continuum.
I have a quick story. It's very, very quick. I was doing, actually with Libby Apple, I was doing a production of Raising the Sun, and the woman who, in Indiana, and the woman who was playing Ruth, my wife, was injured and we didn't find out, she could not do the production, she had a concussion. They had not had time to get an understudy. We had a student matinee, she was going to miss one show. The only person who knew the part was the assistant director, who was Japanese. She put on a wig, and she got the script, and she played my wife in Raisin in the Sun. We had a discussion afterwards with the students. Not one of them asked. Not one. We were all prepared to go, okay, we were going to explain, this is an understudy, this would not have happened in South Side Chicago, it's the 50s, blah, 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 written by, Lorraine Hansberry. Not one question. They just accepted that that's what the case was. And this was more than 20 years ago. So who knows what will happen with August in 50 years?
I think that shift in tension is actually very, very interesting. That was what you were talking about with that society of that time. That's what I got from your wonderful presentation. That, there's so much complexity, and the questions they were asking then kept shifting by the decades.
So hurry up. The music will start playing.
I'm getting played out, and I'm not even at the Oscars.
Wow.
Just one real quick anecdote as well. To your question, I think that's what the responsibility of the arts institutions that are terribly underfunded in this country. That's what we're tasked to do, to encourage people to look at the world differently. And I just wanted to give a shout out. How many of you have seen Viet Gone? Now, one of the wonderful conceits of that playwright was that he turned the language on its head, just to give audiences an idea of what it feels like to be othered. That is the Asian American experience, to be othered in your own country. And so when he's talking gibberish, it's kind of funny, but, and that gave you an insight. And I think we shift the conversation subtly that way, through our art. And kudos to OSF for that.
Yes.
First of all, I just want to say, I came to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival when I was in high school, and I saw a production of King Lear's back in 1985. The actor playing Edmund, his name was Carlos Castellanos. I still remember his name, and it was such a big influence to me. And all these years, I've seen interracial casting. However, when it comes to the English history plays of Shakespeare, I've never seen an actor of color play Richard III, Richard II, Henry V, Henry IV. Do you think that the history, the idea that this is actual history, does that pose as a sort of an obstacle in casting? In the leads, I've seen African Americans actors play Hotspur, other roles in those plays, but never the actual title character.
Come see Prince Hal next year.
And Hotspur.
Yes.
I just want to say a quick thing too. Trevor Nunn actually got in the news 2 years ago about his War of the Roses. Yeah. And he said, well, you know, he chose. So, you know, great. An all-white cast, and basically defended that choice by saying that, well, you know, historically, you know, there were no people of color. At the time, they were trying to investigate sort of historically what it was like during Shakespeare's time. Except Shakespeare wasn't writing at that, he was writing a historical for that time, right? But also that women were not allowed on that stage. So how faithful, what era of faithfulness are we talking about? And that's what I'm talking about, like, when we want to contextualize things, like how far back can we go to be faithful? Do we need groundlings? Do we, you know, give tickets to, you know, people standing, you know? Yeah, right? Do we have a caste system? You know, do we have to replicate that? I mean, what exactly are we trying to contextualize with each and every production? And what are we saying? What are the choices that we're making? And I think that goes to your point about consciousness as well.
I will say that Henry VI was played by Chris Jean, an Asian American company member, but you're definitely right that Henry IV, Henry V, a lot of the histories, probably Richard II, and Richard III. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And every time we can, given that we've been around at OSF for 82 years, every time we can knock down one of those barriers or crash through one of those glass ceilings in terms of who gets to play what, there's still tons of work to do. I agree.
Yes.
I want to give a shout out to Professor Bobilski because I've never gotten to thank you for the play and the folio of it. Eugene, the play was fantastic. We were there. It was wonderful.
This collaboration between us and OSF was so exciting and meaningful last year. Sorry, I know for many of you it was a 3-hour drive, but just an incredible set of opportunities.
Weren't there to see some of our actors showing the different ways, which language are you going to use, which version are you going to use. Yeah. And what would be wonderful would be if there are conversations like that to have around here in our community about whether there are things in the language that inform diversity choices. I don't know what the right word is to use because the populace that you were describing in London at the time had national diversity, but not much racial diversity. So, but whatever that is, if language ever comes up in Shakespeare in terms of which language to choose based on diversity type issues or enabling diversity, it would be an educational thing for all of us, I think.
Well, it's a really interesting comment, and I'm not going to talk forever, but well, because concepts of race were different, and yet the language of race was both different and similar. And it's so hard for us to remember, even if you look at the U.S. Census over the last few decades, that what counts as a race and which things are different races, like that there's 8 Asian races on the American census, but no Latino races, you know, and things that have been on have been moved off, and you know, only multiracial now you can check for, you know, a few iterations of the census. I mean, these make massive differences to how we think, what we think race is, and you know, only the intertwined histories, you know, in the U.S. race is shaped by the trauma of enslavement, and its racial legacies, and in England, where it's a sort of mixture of slavery and colonialism that have shaped that, the way they've used the word black is actually different from the way we do, right? They use it to refer to people of Arab and Asian and South Asian descent, as well as Afro-British. And this is for them, you grow up, you learn the racial language of your time and place. It seems objective to you. It seems descriptive to you when it isn't. But in England, you know, they will look at people and they will see them as black, people that would not happen in the U.S. So, and actually, if you go back into the language of Shakespeare, you'll see those same changes and overlaps and blurrings and shifts happening in ways that I think actually would potentially be very interesting in race-conscious casting, and might even speak to this question of the histories, because what you have are these different tribes that are racializing each other in language that includes, black, savage, all the loaded and hateful terms, right, that characterize race in some sense transhistorically, and that is there in those history plays that would really kind of, I think, make a really complex set of casting decisions possible and productive, and would help educate an audience. But that's only one way. I mean, there's many ways to do these things, but I really appreciate that question and some of the ideas it raises.
A much less interesting point than that, but I'm going to make it real fast, is that I will say when we're working on a Shakespeare script at OSF and I'm directing, because I personally tend to lean toward modern dress productions of Shakespeare. You may have noticed when I direct that if there's a line in a quarto version and a line in a folio version, and one sounds more contemporary, they're both by Shakespeare, but one is just more direct, I'll go with the more direct one because I want that more contemporary sound, because I just think it helps give more access. So that's my own bias when I'm making those choices. I saw.
Another question.
Yeah.
Oh, I just had a quick question about, we talk a lot about, races being represented, and just like people who are identify as multicultural, and how somebody who may not look like a role that they could be playing. Like for myself, I'm African American, Native American, and Filipino. But I know for myself, I'm probably never going to be cast in a Native American role because I don't portray the look of that individual, and so just where that kind of is with Shakespeare and multiculturalism and representing stuff like that. If that makes sense.
I have a response to that. I will say that I hope, as our casting team and our acting company, as these discussions get more sophisticated and deeper, we rely more and more on artist self-identity and not on legibility. That person looks, we've got white actors in the company who are like, come on, I look Latino. Why can't I play a Latino role? I look Latino. And it's like, from a Hollywood point of view, yeah, you could be cast as a Latino, but in terms of what we're trying to do, in terms of creating equity in the world and in the field, not cool. If you self-identify as Native American, then that, I would hope, would be something that we would cherish, and that you would be able to express that part of your identity in a play, So I think more and more and more, to become more responsible, our institutions and people with the power to make decisions should rely more on artist self-identification.
And I think that's really a super critical point, because we're now in a time where the story about the work is as important as the work itself. And when you don't have actors who represent and identify and connect with the communities that they're playing on stage, that's really doing an act of violence to people from those communities, saying, I know all of these actors from my community, and you're telling me you don't have someone on stage who connects with my community. It feels like it's a form of representational violence, a form of exclusion, not to really be giving it a lot of thought in that way about the representational connection with your community. Yeah. And it's a part of the choice, the spectrum of choice that we make when we engage in casting.
Other questions? Yes, back there.
Hi. So, is it acceptable for a director to disregard race in all aspects of its form when casting for a play, a movie, a story that in which race and ethnicity have like no really say to the story itself? Like for instance, like Midsummer Night Dream. I don't really know the play super well. Like I'm not an expert on it to say whether race and ethnicity have like really a say in the story. But because it is quite a fantastic world, it is. Is it okay for the director to completely disregard race when actors come in and cast anybody for any role, basically.
I don't cast.
Yes, I would hope that a director, I think it's hard when you say disregard race. I think your general point, which is can anybody play any role in a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream as conceived by a director? Absolutely. Of course so. Disregard to me means I don't see race, and I think there's just a danger in I don't see who you are. You know what I mean? Well-meaning, usually, not always, but usually white people say with pride, I don't see race, as if that's a great a gift, right? And in fact, those of us who move through the world as white people have the privilege of saying we don't see race, while many of us, you know, who are not, don't have that privilege. And so I'm just struggling with your framing. I think Midsummer Night's Dream, it's probably higher on people's resumes, actors of color having been in Midsummer Night's Dream, because it's very often interpreted multiracially. And that's and for good reason, you know, but I don't know. I feel like I'm spiraling. I'm gonna stop.
You know, there's an interesting thing that someone, I think it was Tim Bond, who said a couple of years ago, because I being asked a similar question about, and it was along the lines, can white people do August Wilson? You know, and I remember going to Tim Bond and I said, how are you answering these kind of questions? And he said, well, what's the issue of the play? I said, well, the issue of his plays is about black people's struggle in this country. He said, well, then it should be cast at this moment as black, because that's what the struggle is. That's the issue of the play. The issue of the play of Midsummer Night's Dream doesn't have to do with a struggle, a racial struggle. So I've used that as a kind of guide, and I don't use it as a complete rule, but I use it as a guide. That when I look at a play and somebody asks, well, why can't they be? I said, because the issue of that play is something that we're dealing with right now. It has to be dealt with those particular actors. No, I'm not going. Didn't we talk to the bell system people? This is from working in schools a lot.
Please, we want you to have the final word, not the robotic voice, so go ahead. Keep going.
Well, all of this makes me think about, you know, Hamilton and In the Heights, because with In the Heights, the music is so incredible. Students love that play. They really want to audition for it. And when it came to when I was at UC Riverside, which is a Hispanic serving institution, there was one or two Latino students cast in the production. It completely changed the meaning of the play. It turned it into, it was a beautiful play. The students were so passionate. They worked so hard. It was the first musical that the department had done in, you know, nobody could remember. And so it was very heartfelt, but it wasn't the play.
Was it mostly white kids?
It was mostly, you know, students of color. It was very multiracial, but it became a story about. It became a story about In the Heights. It became a story about children from immigrant families, first generation students from working class families, and really the drama of going to college and being in your community, and the fragmentation between those going to college and those who are in a community that's undergoing a lot of transition. So part of the story became more universal and relevant, but really it became something different from what the original story was by the way that they cast it. It'll be very interesting what happens 5 years from now, as when Hamilton starts to go into our high schools.
All the time. High school
I
production.
just have a quick add-on. I would actually go further, just because, you know, your question was if race or ethnicity was not relevant. to the plot line, right? And I would actually go further. I take the example of Steel Magnolias, right? Like it's about women in the South. Now, if I were a director, I have every right to say, I want to investigate what it feels like, what it is to be a woman by casting an all-male cast, right? I can totally do that. But then we have to take into account contextually the fact that women are underrepresented on stages. So you got to take into context everything, like, you know, and be a conscious. Again, I keep coming back to this word about consciousness, which, you know, Bill talked about, and awareness. Be aware that you're doing that, and that's all anybody can ask.
Well, thank you very much. We're out of time.